Does that help at all? Okay, good. All right. Well, I've known Jack for a long time, 45 years, the way I compute it, and we've been close friends and colleagues that whole time. I think I probably know about as much about Jack as anybody on the globe, both from a personal and a professional level. I'll be quite selective on the personal side. But I'd like to give you a little background because I think it's relevant to his talk. His parents were Russian Jews, grew up in Vladivostok. They were expelled from the Soviet Union before World War II. They moved to Shanghai, where they settled, and where Jack was born. Jack, of course, was very small when he was born. They were soon, as small as he was, they were soon interned in Shanghai by the Japanese and spent the rest of World War II in an internment camp, 3 years. Then the family resettled. When the internment was over, the family was freed, resettled into a commercial occupation. And then with the Chinese Revolution, 1949, the family was once again on the move, expelled by the Maoist revolution, and moved to Hong Kong, where Jack's dad set up an import-export firm. And I forget why the transition from there to Tokyo, but anyway, soon they wound up living in Tokyo, and that's where Jack's parents spent most of the rest of their lives. Jack grew up in Tokyo. He attended an American international high school there, made friends with a number of English-speaking peers, some of whom remain friends to this day. In fact, one of my colleagues in our history department was one of Jack's classmates. I found to my surprise, and he wound up, not surprisingly, being a historian of Japan. From there, Jack went to McGill University, partly because of a family connection, but he had had English-speaking education up to that point, so McGill was a natural. Then from there, he went to Berkeley, got his PhD in political science from Berkeley, and was appointed to the faculty immediately upon getting his PhD, and has been teaching at Berkeley ever since, retired a year ago. His interests have always been in a kind of, have long been in trade-offs, I would say. Early in his career, he was particularly interested in political trust in government, and the kind of the trade-offs between trust in government and partisanship or partisan policy attitudes. Very influential early research on political trust back in the 1970s. One paper I remember being quite impressed by was a paper showing that throughout the 1960s and 70s, Republicans had been consistently more distrustful of government than Democrats, which might figure, given that Democrats were the party of big government. But then when Reagan became president, the party difference flipped, so that after 1980, Republicans were more trusting of government than Democrats. So that's the kind of finding that Jack has specialized in over his long career. From there, he got involved in a research project on the California tax revolt, very timely, late 70s, early 80s. Produced 2 co-authored books from that project in the early 1980s, which was part of a long interest he's had in California state politics. He's probably the leading academic expert on California state politics, not a trivial subject. Started a journal, online journal on that subject. Then as the 80s wore on, he started to move into research on national identity and immigration, identity politics, and that's going to be the outgrowth of some of that is what we'll hear about today. That line of research produced a lot of articles and so on, culminated in another co-authored book in 2014 called American Identity and the Politics of Multiculturalism. Another feature of Jack's career is that he's mentored many of the outstanding students produced by the Berkeley Political Science Department, and some of the names that come to my mind are Dennis Chong, Don Green, Amy Lehrman, John Sides, Matt Wright, Morris Levy, Kara Wong here, and Morris here also. So he's had a very distinguished career as a researcher, academic publications, and teacher and mentor to many, many students, and he's been a wonderful friend of mine for all these many 45 years. So my great pleasure to introduce to you Jack Citrin.
Talk and also to be awarded the Harold Lasswell Award by ISPP. I think if you had to name the founding fathers of political psychology, Harold Lasswell would be the grandfather and David Sears would be the father. And so I benefited so much from my friendship with David and from his teaching me psychology. I'm someone who never took a psychology course. My knowledge of that subfield is pretty sparse, but you know, with a teacher like him, I was able to have the right footnotes at least. He also neglected to say that the co-authored books on the tax revolt and American Identity and the Politics of Multiculturalism were co-authored by him, so you know, that's typical modesty. I want to say a couple more things before I get started here. First of all, full disclosure, the title of the talk is not the title that's in the program. The reason for that is our president, Eva Green here, of course, with typical non-American efficiency. I don't want to stereotype her national identity here, but she asked me for a title about 9 months ago. I had no concept of what I would be talking about, and then there it was in the program and so forth. But anyway, this is what I know about, and this is what I'm going to talk about. And before I start again, I want to thank, this work is sort of a culmination of work that David and I did, but also that Kara Wong here in the front row and my friend Morris Levy, who's sitting here, that we've all contributed. We all worked on this together and produced some good papers together, and their contribution has been essential. And Morris very generously has accepted to be the clicker on the PowerPoints, because where I am on the technological evolutionary ladder is somewhere below an amoeba, whatever that is. I forget my high school biology. Okay, so let me start. Thank you again, Eva, for a wonderful conference. I think you've done a great job. So, identity has had a long run as the preferred conceptual lens for looking at both group conflict and cohesion. Today, the term is actually in danger of being pushed aside by the more evocative and ominous, quote, tribalism, unquote. Anthropologists may be squirming, but we are told that there are political tribes and moral tribes to go along with the more familiar ethnic, religious, and cultural tribes. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary defines tribalism as, quote, attitudes and behavior reflecting loyalty to one's social group, what social psychologists would more prosaically simply call in-group favoritism. The august New York Times has pronounced tribalism an innate human instinct, now rearing its head to spread fragmentation through the West. And in this vein, in her recent interesting book, subtitled Group Instinct and the Fate of Nations, Amy Chua has called for the emergence of a, quote, super tribe, unquote, to mitigate the corrosive effects of identity politics. This is what, you know, Stephen Wright yesterday called a superordinate identity, I guess. But super tribe is more sexy. Now, in many elite circles, nationalism and national identity appear to actually have become dirty words, blamed for intolerance at home and conflict abroad. Now, this development is in some ways surprising, since historically, nationalism was a doctrine seeking to overcome more parochial group loyalties, albeit often by force. Rupert Emerson, writing as colonialism was winding down in the early 1960s, posited that, quote, "The nation is the largest community which, when the chips are down, effectively commands men's loyalty, overriding the claims both of the lesser communities within it and those which cut across it or potentially enfold it within a still greater society," unquote. Now, with globalization gnawing away from without and multiculturalism from within, is this claim about the strength of national identity still valid? In other words, can a compelling, overarching national identity still overcome the divisive effects of more bounded, quote, tribal, unquote, attachments, including the powerful impetus we shall see of political party that emerges from the analysis that I'm going to present below. Now, in this talk, I focus just on how Americans balance their national and ethnic identities at a moment when many describe the United States as a fractured country and consider the ideal of a pluribus unum a relic of the past. But the expectations outlined actually could just as easily be applied to other nation states or to the European Union, in fact. Now, Morris, I should have told you, next slide. You know, this is sort of typical. I'm quite hostile to PowerPoints, actually, because I don't know how to create them very well. But here, outline of the talk, okay? All right. Now, identity is a slippery concept, simultaneously pointing to sameness with some and difference from others. We all know that. We've heard this throughout the conference. Now, I have a conception of collective identity, social identity, that distinguishes between three components. These are also familiar. So the cognitive dimension of social identity refers to self-categorization, or who I am. The affective dimension to the emotional strength of membership in that particular category. And the normative dimension, which is sometimes neglected, is to the attributes describing the prototypical member of the group. One can obviously call oneself an American without being very patriotic, and patriots may disagree about what it means to be an American. A lack of consensus on what demarcates this imagined national community is what signals fragmentation rather than solidarity. So I snuck in the words from the previous title. Okay. Now, the existence of multiple social identities means that the contrasts invoked, the relevant we and the relevant they, will vary according to the context of decision making. In time of war, national identities are salient, whereas during an election, partisan, ideological, or subnational group identities are more likely to govern behavior. Group competition, thus, is a common determinant of how, quote, we are distinguished from them, and cues provided by politicians, journalists, and activists influence the salience of particular identifications, what is primed or made prominent, right? Now, in the United States and other culturally plural societies, national ethnic identities do not completely overlap. So the subjective problem of prioritizing one we over another sometimes can arise. My grandmother actually had a very simple answer to this dilemma. She decided every political issue, large and small, by asking one and only one question. That question is, what's good for the Jews? I suspect that most people have a more nuanced set of group identifications and are unlikely to rely on just one such heuristic. Still, as with my grandmother's example, the centrality or the emotional significance of a particular identity will determine, or will shape at least, which loyalty predominates. For example, is it ethnic group first or nation first? Is it nation first or Europe first? Okay? And many political domestic issues, such as taxation, health, or environmental politics, may divide ethnic groups, but do not obviously pit national against ethnic identities. Yet there are counterexamples such as trade, military aid, or immigration policies, notably. And sometimes, as the example of the Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor shows, the claims of strong national and ethnic identities tug in opposite directions. Who am I for? Who will I fight for? In that particular case, loyalty to the United States overwhelmingly prevailed despite the discrimination of the government against the Japanese Americans. More recent examples of the political consequences of this identity choice or prioritization are voting on the referendum on Scottish independence and on Brexit. The relative strength of Scottish, English, and European identities clearly mattered in how people voted. Prior research indicates that a sense of threat to a group's tangible interests and symbolic status is one factor influencing identity prioritization and choice. So looking at American public opinion in the Trump era is especially apposite because his rhetoric proclaiming, quote, America first, unquote, and attacking Muslims and immigrants from Mexico arguably has raised the salience of both national and ethnic identities, possibly in different ways across groups. Indeed, Diana Mutz, in a quite widely cited article, has argued that Trump owes his victory to white resentment about the changing ethnic composition of the United States and to the decline of the global hegemony of the United States relative to China. Other narratives highlight simply racism as the determining cause of his victory. In response, defenders of America First argue against this, saying that the elevation of national identity serves to unify the country in the face of the racial and ethnic tribalisms fostered by the left. Whatever one's preferred interpretation, the implication is that Trump is changing how the country's constituent groups are prioritizing national and ethnic identities in politics, and as the president who gets infinite media coverage, to many people's disgust, that raises the salience of these issues quite clearly. So what I'm going to present now is a whole series of data, of table. You know, I'm a data guy, and this is quite simple analyses. I'm going to summarize what's on the slides, but you know, I think they're reasonably clear, and probably you can see most of it. And what I'm going to do is look at evidence from the 2012 and 2016 American National Election Studies, and also from the 2014 GSS, which was run by National NORC in University of Chicago. And basically, the analysis is going to be very, very simple. We're going to look at ethnic differences, whites, blacks, and Latinos. There's not a large enough Asian American sample to look at that group. So those three major groups, ethnic groups in the country, and also partisan differences. Because the underlying debate, in some sense, or an underlying question is, does ethnic identification erode national identity? Or can national and ethnic identities, in some sense, be complementary rather than collide? That's one question. How does this work, and how does prioritization affect this? And the second theme I'm going to look at is the role of party and partisan difference in this context. So that gives kind of preview of where we're going to go. Okay? So now, turning to data, there actually is scant evidence that national identity, or sort of national identity, is waning due to the rising emotional significance of ethnicity, particularly among minority groups. Okay? In the 2012 and 2016 ANES elections, these were post-interview elections, so Trump had already been elected by the time these interviews took place. Respondents were asked a familiar question: how important is being American to your identity? How important is your ethnic group to your identity? Identification as an American, you might consider this a mix of self-categorization and affect, actually, is pervasive among whites, blacks, and Latinos alike, with more than 2/3 of each group saying this is extremely or very important for them. Latinos are slightly less likely to give these responses, but in general, the difference across the groups are small, and they hardly changed between 2012 and 2016. By contrast, ethnicity clearly matters far less in the self-categorization of whites, and in that variable, there's clear evidence of what David Sears has called black exceptionalism, with African Americans far more likely than other groups to stress the importance of race or ethnicity. Among blacks and whites, this mode of identification did increase a little between 2012 and 2016, but among whites, no such reaction is visible. Now, among all three ethnic groups, next slide maybe, Morris, the two modes of self-categorization do not conflict, at least insofar the correlation between them up there, look at the first row there, the correlation between them is positive. And again, much more so among blacks. Okay. Next, turning to patriotism. Patriotism, which you can define as pride in and love of one's country, actually remains the order of the day. Although whites were most positive, majorities in all three groups said they loved America, and dislike was virtually absent. That's not really shown in this slide because that item was only in the 2012 study. Okay, the flag, a ubiquitous symbol of nationhood, elicits mainly strongly positive emotions, although less so among blacks. And this gap, this ethnic gap, has consistently appeared in earlier surveys as well. There's a hint of more enthusiasm for the flag among whites and Latinos in 2016 and less among blacks, but actually an unfortunate word in change in the response options, for which I blame the ANES Board of Overseers, Nick, makes it difficult to be confident about what this actually means. And as one might expect, the previous slide again showed that a strong American identity is positively associated with patriotism among ethnic groups. But again, this connection clearly is stronger among whites. Now, turning to prioritization, ask the question, when the chips are down, how do Americans prioritize their national and ethnic identities? To measure this identity choice in the National Election Study data, what I did was simply subtract the response of the importance of ethnicity question from the response to the same question about American identity. So you have three groups: those who said ethnic identity, relatively more important, those for whom the response was equal, and then those who prioritized national over ethnic identity, okay? All right. In all three groups, actually just a small minority prioritized ethnicity over nationality, and questions posed in this way. But whites start apart from blacks and to a lesser extent from Latinos in how much more importance they attribute to categorizing themselves as Americans, or how much more importance they attribute to Americanism as part of their selves. Among blacks, a large majority, you can see this in both years, give the two dimensions of equal identity, and while Latinos, 47% in 2012, but somewhat less, 37% in 2016, chose what might be termed a hyphenated identity, or what Stephen Wright yesterday called a dual identity. Okay. Now, prioritizing one's American identity over one's ethnic identity is associated with positive feelings about the flag, and this holds true in all three groups. Among blacks and Latinos, though, what is compelling is the differences in what you might call the nationalist group, prioritization of national over ethnic, and what you might call the dual or hyphenated group, that sort of middle group. Those differences on patriotism and other things actually are quite minimal, confirming what Dave Sears and I found actually in our earlier analysis of Los Angeles County studies, which use a different measure, so it's compelling that both measures, different measures, produce the same kind of outcome. Okay. There is some evidence of assimilation among Latino attitudes in the sense that the third generation Latino respondents are more likely to say that being an American was more important than ethnicity for their identity, 51% compared to 27% of the first generation respondents. Now remember, in this particular study, everyone's a naturalized citizen. Everyone's a citizen, either naturalized or born, because this is the election study and they only sample survey. Okay? If there is, so, excuse me, let me go back to where, yeah. Among the third generation, Latinos, 38% rated the importance of American ethnic identities, equally compared to 53% of the first generation. So from each generation, sort of the sense of oneself as an American, understandably, increases, and I think that confirms a lot of other studies. So for today's Latino immigrants, the choice of a hyphenated identity seems to be a kind of a halfway house, much as was the case for early European newcomers in the equivalent early stages of acculturation. And so Samuel Huntington's grim prophecy that among Latino ethnic identification, attachment to America will conflict and collide, that hypothesis, I think, still fails 15 years after he wrote that book. If there's any threat to a strong national identity, it actually comes more from generational change than immigration. So if we look at young people these days, yeah, okay, Generation Y, born after 1980, Generation X, born after 64, 80, the boomers, and my own greatest generation. Well, it's called your own generation the greatest, you know. See how younger people code these variables? We'll see. Anyway, this data shows up there a moderate but unmistakable decline in the importance of being American and less consistent patriotism among the younger two cohorts in all ethnic backgrounds. I think it's a product of combination of events and socialization. Okay. All right. Okay. Now we know that partisanship has become a strong and polarizing social identity. Shanto Iyengar and many others find that Democrats and Republicans increasingly view each other negatively and actually see the other party as a threat more than was the case than in the past. Strong partisans seem reluctant to have their children marry someone from the other party. And this manifestation in particular of outgroup hostility does smack of classical tribalism, where the notion of tribalism actually bases on kinship ties. Okay? Okay. So there's an array of findings showing consistent connections between partisanship and both ethnic and national identification. Here you start to see changes between 2012 and 2016 that suggested Trump's candidacy mattered. Okay? Among whites, a stronger sense of American identity is associated with a Republican affiliation, and this increased a little between 2012 and 2016. Figures, I think, of 0.18 and 0.26, and actually declined among Latinos. Relationship was small to begin with, but 0.10 goes down to just nothing, 0.02. The direct measure of prioritization, American identity minus ethnic identity, shows a similar pattern. Now here, tellingly, the more fervent one's preference for one's own party and the stronger one's dislike of the other party, the stronger this relationship. I don't show this here, it's a little complicated. Among Democrats, both whites and Latinos, affective polarization, which is what weakens the importance of being an American to one's identity. Among Republicans, the opposite is true. The more you like your party and dislike the other, more you're going to say that being American is important. Patriotism, as measured by patriotism as measured by feelings of the flag, again has partisan overtones, and the relation between identifying as a Republican and saluting the flag also increased substantially between 2012 and 2016, and this change was driven primarily by whites. Okay, moving to sort of the measure of what your party leads you to, or in all three ethnic groups, but particularly among whites, a strong sense of American identity was associated with voting for Romney in 12, but even more for Trump in 2016. Ethnic identity, which so the identity of white nationalism, white identity among whites had a similar but weaker effect. But among blacks and Latinos, and this is where a difference between the ethnic groups shows itself, ethnic consciousness had the opposite effect. The more strongly you identified as an ethnic, with your ethnic group, the more likely you were to vote Democratic. And just a small aside, much has been made of Trump's appeal to white working class voters, defined as people without college degrees. Compared to the college educated, this group does actually have a stronger sense of American identification, and as whites in both 2012 and 2016. Okay? In both groups, however, Republican identification and presidential voting were similarly linked to stronger attachment to both American white identities, but again, This relationship increased modestly between 2012 and 2016. And the shift was more marked when it came to feelings about the flag. So without panel data, you know, one's reluctant to argue, make a causal argument these changes are due to priming by Trump's rhetoric in his campaign. But certainly it's a plausible assumption, and the data moves in that direction. You have to remember also, well, if you're looking for Trump effects, that this data was collected a month after his election and does not record the effect of the last 2 years. So one might speculate about what current data would show. Okay, turning now back to the initial question, I would argue that a strong national identity can better help hold a multi-ethnic state together if there's agreement on what defines the nation and its members. That is, on what creates and sustains the so-called imagined community. Now here the dominant contrast in the literature, which Roger Brubaker has articulated in excellent work, is between a civic or universalistic conception of American identity, which emphasizes a commitment to fundamental values and institutions, and an ethnic conception which makes descent a criterion of membership and can exclude certain ethnic or religious minorities. Now, for better or worse, I invented in 1990, which tells you how long I've been studying this topic, what has become a common technique for measuring subjective conceptions of national identity in surveys. The measure asks people to rate the importance of certain factors in making someone a, quote, true national, unquote, in this case, a true American. And so from this first study of mine in 1990, research consistently finds that actually the civic elements of American identity, such as respect for institutions, treating people equally, being a citizen, and feeling American, are more widely endorsed than the more exclusionary criteria, such as being born in the United States or being a Christian. Still, the recent data from both the 2014 GSS, which is up there now, and also from the 2016 National Elections Study indicate that remains a substantial segment who do define American identity in ascribed terms of birth and religion. The next slide shows some different items. And you can see that speaking English, which I don't regard as an ethnic criterion actually, it's a pragmatic thing that people can learn, or adopting customs, which again people can learn if they choose, are more widely endorsed than nativity and ancestry. And the other thing about this particular slide, which I'll take a look at because I haven't seen it for a while, is that, again, the ethnic differences are not great. You look at these very small differences. Now, the Latinos are a little less likely to say ancestry in speaking English. That's sort of predictable, given that many of them are second generation or even first generation immigrants, and the language issue is obviously more of a compelling issue for people who are recent immigrants. Most of the black respondents are not. Almost none are immigrants. Okay, so ethnic differences, again, are relatively minor, even in 2016. And in an earlier study, Matt Wright and I found that whites, blacks, and Latinos all rank respecting the country's institution as most important, making someone a true American. All groups, including Latinos, we see this here, overwhelmingly agree on the importance of speaking English, and blacks and Latinos actually are as likely to rate nativity and Christianity as very important, a noteworthy fact that given that this is an axis of current controversy. Now, these are bivariate relationships. Start controlling for things like age and education. Things change a little bit, but not much. Okay? So, finally, in all groups as well, the greater the stated importance of being American to one's identity, the more likely one is to accept the idea that there is such a thing as a true American by endorsing a number of these states. Republicans are also more likely than Democrats to agree that being born in America, speaking English, having American ancestry, and adopting American customs are very important. And move on to, if we move on, a couple of slides, we'll get to some issues. endorsing an ethnic rather than the civic conception of American identity matters a lot when it comes to attitudes about immigration and multiculturalism. And you see that if you endorse these ethnic notions, you're much more likely to oppose immigration, policies to help immigrants, the fact that immigrants might maintain their original cultures. Okay. So the Republican seizure of the national mantle preceded Trump, but his conduct likely will foster greater partisan disagreement about the meaning of American nationhood. Now, I inferred from these somewhat different findings regarding ethnic and partisan differences, and this is an important point to me, that increasing ethnic diversity per se does not preclude sustaining inclusive common identity. Partisanship, or ethnicity refracted through partisanship, is the more potent threat today to a common sense of national identity in the United States. And as their electoral incentives, as they always have been, for the parties to appeal to voters on the basis of ethnic affinity, the intensification of what has been called political tribalism will sustain this centrifugal force. Now, what about the impact of these identities on political preferences? Here I go to the last slide, and it's got lots of figures. I'm going to just summarize this very briefly and then conclude. Okay? This is multivariate analysis of the 2016 ANES with controls for party and demographic variables. The main thing I was looking at is those American ID and ethnic ID coefficients. Okay? What do these results show? People with a strong sense of American identity are more willing, as we said earlier, to favor reducing immigration. They're willing to restrict foreign imports. They view China as a threat. But also they are less willing to spend more money to help blacks and less willing to accept affirmative action as a policy. Now, this influence of American identity, of course, is most consistent with whites, but actually is present in a muted form among Latinos and blacks as well. And these models, which white identity, ethnic identity among whites is only weak and inconsistent effects, whereas ethnic identification among minority groups is significantly associated just with opinions on issues that visibly affect group interests. Now, all these findings confirm a point that Leonie Huddy meant in her superb summary of the research on group identity and cohesion in the Handbook of Political Psychology, where she says that group identity is a more potent source of behavior among smaller, more homogeneous, often disadvantaged groups, particularly in contexts where the states are visible. These findings, I think, also raise the question, which others have asked, whether among whites, nationality and ethnicity are really, in America, are really irrelevant to each other because they're psychologically fused in some sense. Okay? In either case, whatever you think about that last point, this is a sort of normative point, the fact that among whites a stronger national identity and patriotism are tied to opposition to policies favored by minority groups is unsettling for the future of social solidarity. Political science reveres parties, deeming them essential to democracy. But today it may be worth recalling, just 2 days after the 4th of July, George Washington's farewell address. In that address, he recognized that the spirit of party can, quote, serve to keep liberty alive, unquote, but he also warned of its, quote, baneful effect on fomenting national disunity. Donald Trump has raised the salience of nationalism in American politics, and to repeat, it seems that the growing party polarization regarding differences in the strength and meaning of American identity rather than the changed ethnic composition of the country are the real challenge to a pluribus unum. In a diverse society, only consensus on an inclusive concept of nationhood can be unifying in the long run. I'm an immigrant to America, the only member of my biological family to be an American, to live in America. So being an American means, I'm told, you have to accentuate the positive. So I'm going to close on a slightly more positive note. For now, the data doesn't show a visible shift in public opinion for a civic to white Christian identity as the basis of the American polity. The evidence presented here shows that majorities of all the country's ethnic groups claim that being an American is very important in how they view themselves. Patriotism also is widespread. Prioritization varies across the groups, but in no case is ethnicity the dominant mode of identification. The dual mode of identification really does nothing to undermine Americanism or American identity. Okay? So in sum, it clearly is too early to write the obituary of the nationalism in the United States or indeed anywhere else. National identities are rooted in culture and historical memory, and they have enormous staying power. Despite the inroads of globalization, the cosmopolitan vision of citizens of the world on open borders is still a daydream. For better or worse, rooting for the home team seems to be the default psychological response. So don't throw away your flags just yet. Thank you.